The telegram said December 20th, 1882. His mail-order bride would arrive at the Marysville train station. Yates Franklin was there by 8 in the morning, even though the train wasn't due until 11. Then the blizzard hit. The worst storm Montana had seen in years buried the tracks under 6 feet of snow. The train was stuck 40 miles to the west. The station master told him to go home. That train might not come for days. Yates didn't move. He came back the second day. The snow was still falling. No train. He came back the third day. His fingers were numb. His hope should have been frozen solid. But he stayed, because somewhere out there, a woman named Victoria was cold and scared, wondering if anyone would be waiting for her when she finally arrived. And Yates Franklin had made a promise. When that train finally pulled into the station 3 days late, Victoria stepped onto the platform and saw him standing there, covered in snow, exactly where he said he would be. That was the moment she knew she had found something rare. A man who keeps his word. This story will teach you that the best things in life are worth waiting for. That love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make and a promise you keep every single day. And that sometimes 3 days of patience can build a lifetime of happiness. If you've ever wondered whether someone out there is waiting for you, this story is your reminder that good men still exist. Men who keep their promises even when the storm tells them to quit. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the longest you've ever waited for something worth having? Your likes and shares help women everywhere find stories that restore their faith in love. Subscribe so you never miss a story that speaks to your soul. That telegram showed up at the ranch right when the December wind started to scream across the plains of Montana. It carried the news that was about to turn Yates Franklin's whole life upside down. His mail-order bride was set to arrive in Marysville on the 20th of December, 1882. Yates just stood there in the doorway of his small ranch house. He read that flimsy piece of paper over and over until the words all ran together. He was 26 years old, with a face weathered by the sun and a body hardened by tough work. His shoulders were wide from years of roping cattle and fixing fences. His dark hair was always in need of a good trim, and his calloused hands knew more about blisters than anything soft. But his eyes held a real kindness, and around these parts his word was as good as solid gold. He'd spent 3 solid months writing back and forth with Victoria Jane Morrison, a young lady of 23 from Pennsylvania. She had answered his advertisement in a paper for folks looking to get married. Her letters were full of thought and honesty. She talked about wanting an adventure and a new beginning after her father passed away, which left her with not much of a future. Back in the East, his ranch was spread out over 200 acres of decent grazing land, but Yates pretty much worked it all by himself. His closest neighbor was a good 5 miles to the south, and the town of Marysville was 8 miles to the north. It was just a handful of wooden buildings all huddled around the railroad station that tied this little piece of Montana to the rest of the world. It was not a whole lot, but it was his. He earned it with back-breaking labor and being careful with his money. Now, he was hoping it would become theirs. He had sent his last letter to Victoria 6 weeks back. Inside, he put the money for her train ticket and a picture of himself standing all stiff and proper in front of his barn, holding his hat in his hands, trying to look as respectable as he could. Her answer had been so warm. She accepted his proposal and promised she would be there before Christmas. Just thinking about it made his heart pound in a way that riding a wild bronco never did. The days leading up to the 20th seemed to drag on forever. Yates buried himself in getting everything ready. He cleaned the house from top to bottom, put a fresh coat of whitewash on the bedroom walls, and even bought brand new sheets and blankets from the general store. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the place with her husband, just gave him a knowing little smile. She helped him pick out some nice curtains for the bedroom window. He bought coffee and sugar, flour, and a big sack of dried beans. He was dead set that Victoria would not find his kitchen empty. He even took a chance and ordered a new dress for her out of a catalog, guessing her size from what she wrote in her letters. She had said she was about average height with dark blonde hair and blue eyes, slim but strong from all the years she spent helping her father in his print shop. On the morning of the 20th, Yates was up long before the sun. He shaved with extra care, cutting himself twice because his hands were shaking a little. He put on his best wool suit, the one he only wore for church on Sundays or the rare wedding. He saddled up his horse, Dancer, a dependable bay gelding. Then he hitched up the wagon, put down a thick layer of fresh hay, and covered it with his best blankets to make the ride back to the ranch comfortable for her. The morning air was so cold it hurt to breathe, the kind of cold that turned your breath into a white cloud and made your fingers go numb even inside thick gloves. He made it to Marysville by 8 in the morning, even though the train was not supposed to get there until 11. The town was just starting to wake up, with thin gray columns of smoke rising from the chimneys. The train depot was a simple red wooden building. Inside, there was a pot-bellied stove for heat and a telegraph office right next to it. Clarence Webb, the station master, was already at his desk sorting papers and getting ready for the day. "Morning, Yates," Clarence called out when he saw him, looking up from his work. He was a skinny man in his 50s with glasses that were always sliding down his nose. "You are here mighty early. That train is not due for a few hours yet." "I know that," Yates answered, stomping the snow off his boots as he came inside. "I just wanted to be sure everything was all set." Clarence's leathery face softened up with a look of understanding. "Your bride is arriving today, is that right? I seem to recall you mentioning it last month." "Yes, sir. Victoria Jane Morrison from Pennsylvania. I sure hope the trains are running on schedule." "They ought to be," Clarence said, but his face told a different story. "The weather has been holding pretty steady these last few days, cold but clear. The telegraph lines are up and working, and I have not heard about any delays." He stopped for a second, pushing his glasses back up his nose. "Although you just never know this time of year. A storm can blow in out of nowhere." A little flicker of worry sparked in Yates, but he pushed it down. The sky was clear that morning, a pale, endless blue. Surely the weather would hold out. He spent the whole morning pacing up and down the wooden platform, pulling out his pocket watch every few minutes. He tried to settle the wild mix of excitement and pure terror that was churning around in his gut. What if she takes one look at me and decides to get right back on that train? What if I am a big disappointment to her? What if the ranch is just too far from everything, too rough for a woman who grew up in the civilized East? His letters had been honest about how hard life on the frontier could be, and her replies had promised him that she understood, but reading about it in a letter was one thing, and living it was something else entirely. As the morning wore on, other folks from town started showing up. Thomas Green, the fellow who ran the saloon, came by to get a shipment of whiskey. Mary Sullivan was waiting on some fabric that was coming all the way from Chicago. Old Henry Martinez was there for medicine for his aching joints. They all said hello to Yates and gave him some good-natured jokes about him finally getting hitched. All the attention made him feel a bit awkward, but he took it with as much good grace as he could find. 11 o'clock came, and then it was gone. Clarence checked his telegraph machine and said the train was running about 30 minutes late. It had been held up for a bit in Helena, but was making good time now. Yates started his pacing all over again. The temperature had definitely dropped, and a thick bank of gray clouds was starting to build up on the western horizon. He did not like the look of those clouds one bit. 11:30 passed. Then it was noon. Clarence got another message over the wire. The train was delayed again. Now they were saying it would be around 2 in the afternoon. Some kind of mechanical trouble with one of the cars. It was nothing serious, they said, but it still needed to be fixed. Yates decided to walk over to the hotel restaurant and make himself eat something, even though he did not have any appetite at all. He managed to get down a bowl of stew and about half a loaf of bread, and washed it all down with some strong, bitter coffee. When he got back to the depot at 1:30, the sky had turned a dark, mean-looking gray. The wind had really picked up, and it was biting cold, carrying that sharp smell that tells you snow is coming. Clarence was looking worried now, too. He was standing out on the platform, studying those clouds with an eye that had seen many winters. "A storm is coming," he said, plain and simple. "And it looks like a big one." "Do you think the train will make it through?" Yates asked, trying his best to keep the worry out of his voice. "Hard to say. It all depends on how fast that train is moving and how fast this storm moves in. It could go either way. Yates stood there on the platform with his hands jammed deep into his coat pockets and just watched the western sky. The clouds were rolling in for real now, like a heavy gray blanket being pulled over the whole world. The first snowflakes started to fall around 2:15. They were big and wet, and they stuck to his coat and his hat. In just a few minutes, the snowfall got much heavier, coming down in thick sheets that made it hard to see more than a few yards in front of you. Clarence got another telegram at 2:30. The train was stopped cold, 40 miles to the west. It was unable to move forward through the snow that was piling up on the tracks. The message said it would have to wait out the worst of the storm and would start moving again as soon as the tracks were clear enough. The estimated time of arrival was now unknown. Yates felt a coldness settle deep in his chest, and it had nothing to do with the freezing weather. How long could that take? Clarence just shook his head slowly. Could be hours. Could be days. These December storms, they can be a real bear. It might blow over by morning, or it might just settle in and stay for a week. There's just no way of knowing. The afternoon dragged on into the evening. The snow just kept falling, heavy and without a break. It piled up on the platform and turned the main street into a white, empty wilderness. Most of the townspeople finally gave up and went on home, but Yates stayed right where he was. He stood under the little bit of roof over the depot platform, just watching the empty tracks disappear into all that whiteness. He pictured Victoria out there somewhere, cold and probably scared, wondering if her cowboy was ever going to be there waiting for her. As it got dark, Clarence finally talked him into going to the hotel. "You are going to freeze to death out here, son," he said, his voice firm. "This storm is not letting up. That train will not be coming tonight. Go on and get yourself a hot meal and a warm bed. You can come back in the morning." Yates reluctantly agreed it was the only sensible thing to do. He took Dancer and the wagon over to the livery stable, making sure his horse had plenty of food and water. Then he walked through snow that was already up to his knees to get to the Marysville Hotel. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Alner Frost, showed him to a small room on the second floor that was clean and simple. He hardly slept a wink all night, just listening to the wind howl and scream around the building, and the sound of the snow hitting the window pane like sand. The storm raged on through the night and was still going strong the next morning. Yates was back at the depot by dawn, even though you could barely tell the difference between dawn and night in the thick gray light. Clarence was already at the depot, and he looked plumb tuckered out. He said the telegraph wires were still working, but just barely. The train was still stuck a good 40 miles to the west. In some spots, the snow had drifted over the tracks as high as 6 feet. Railroad crews were out there trying to clear the line, but it was slow going. Clarence told him, "It could be today, or it could be tomorrow." He promised, "I will send word the minute I hear something for sure." But Yates didn't head out. He just couldn't. The picture of Victoria stuck out there, delayed and all by herself, kept his boots planted on that platform. He stomped his feet to fight off the biting cold and took the cup of coffee Clarence poured for him from his own thermos. The snow kept falling all day, though it wasn't as fierce as the day before. By the afternoon, it had slowed to just a few flurries here and there, but the storm had already done its work. Marysville was buried under 3 feet of new snow, and some of the drifts were taller than a man's head. That night, he finally went back to the hotel, too cold and bone-tired to put up a fuss. Mrs. Frost made sure he sat down for a proper supper. She was a motherly sort of woman in her 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes, and she fussed over him like a mother hen with just one chick. "That young lady is mighty lucky to have a man so dedicated," she said as she placed a plate of roast chicken and potatoes in front of him. "Not many fellas would wait around the way you are." Yates just said, "I gave her my promise. I told her I'd be here when her train arrived. I plan on keeping that promise." The second night wasn't as hard as the first. Sheer exhaustion dragged him into a deep sleep. But his dreams were full of endless white fields and trains that never showed up. He woke up to sunshine pouring through his window, the first real sun he'd seen in 3 days. A little bit of hope jumped in his chest. Down at the depot, Clarence met him with some better news. The crews had finally broken through the biggest snowdrift around midnight. The train started rolling again about 3 hours ago. If things keep going smoothly, it should get to Marysville by early afternoon. The forecast said no more snow, just a whole lot of cold. Yates felt some of the tightness leave his shoulders. She was really going to make it today. Barring any new troubles, yes, sir. The last telegraph said that train is moving along steady now. I reckon we can expect it around 1 or 2 o'clock. The morning went by in a haze of waiting. Yates must have walked the length of that platform 100 times. He cleared the snow off the steps and pulled out his pocket watch so often he was sure he'd wear the thing out. Other folks from town started to show up. Some were there on actual business, but a lot of them were just plain curious to see how this whole drama they'd been watching was going to end. Around noon, Yates saw a little group of kids building a snowman near the depot. Their laughter seemed to cut right through his anxious nerves, and he found himself smiling in spite of it all. A little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old walked up to him shyly. She asked, "Mister, are you waiting for your sweetheart?" Yates replied, "Yes, I am." And the little girl said, "My mama says you've been here for 3 whole days." "That's a very long time." He agreed with her. "It sure is, but she's worth waiting for." The little girl thought about this with a serious look on her face. Then she nodded and ran back to her friends. For Yates, some of that nervousness turned into pure resolve. 3 days was nothing. He would have waited 3 weeks or even 3 months if he had to. Victoria had crossed half the country just to be with him. The very least he could do was be there when she finally arrived. At 1:15, somebody down the street let out a shout. "Train whistle! I can hear the train!" Yates's heart started to pound in his chest. He walked right to the edge of the platform, straining his ears to hear. And there it was, faint at first but clear as day, the long, low whistle of the locomotive. Then came the steady chugging of the engine, getting louder and louder. He saw smoke off in the distance, a dark plume against the white land. And then he saw the train itself, pushing its way through the snow like some great stubborn animal. It pulled into the station with a loud hiss of steam and a squeal of its brakes, right on time by Clarence's new estimate, but 3 days late by the original one. The engine was covered in ice and snow, and icicles were hanging from every single surface. The passenger cars right behind it looked just as beat up from their trip through the blizzard. Yates just stood there like a statue, his eyes scanning every window, looking for any sign of a woman with dark blonde hair. The conductor was the first one to climb down, shaking his head at Clarence. "Worst trip I've had in 10 years, he said. "The passengers are cold, hungry, and sick and tired of being on that train. I'm just glad to finally be here." Then the passengers started to get off. There was an older couple moving slowly and stiffly, a businessman carrying a leather bag, a family with 3 small children. A wave of panic started to rise in Yates. What if she never got on the train in the first place? What if something bad had happened to her? And then she appeared in the doorway of the passenger car, and for Yates, it felt like the whole world just stopped turning. Victoria Jane Morrison was more beautiful than any picture could ever show. Her dark blonde hair was tied back in a simple bun, but a few loose strands had escaped and framed her face. Her blue eyes looked tired and a little red, but they shined with smarts and determination. She had on a dark blue traveling dress that had clearly seen better days. It was all rumpled from being on a delayed train for 3 days, and she held a worn-out travel bag in one gloved hand. She looked tired and cold and a little bit lost, but the moment her eyes found Yates standing there on the platform, her whole face changed, lighting up with relief and something else that looked a lot like joy. "Victoria," Yates said, taking a step forward. His voice came out more gravelly than he'd meant it to. "Yates Franklin," she answered, and her voice was like music to him, soft with an accent from the East that sounded very refined to his ears. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Yates. I've been waiting for you." Something in her eyes seemed to change, to soften. "I can see that," she said in a quiet voice. The conductor told me this morning that you've been here every day since the train was supposed to get here. He said you never left, not even when the storm was at its worst. Yates could feel his face getting warm. Well, I gave you my word I'd be here. Seemed important to keep it. Victoria stepped down from the train, taking the conductor's offered hand to steady herself. And then she was standing right in front of Yates, so close he could see the tiny snowflakes caught in her hair and the light dusting of freckles across her nose that the picture hadn't shown. They just stood there for a second, two people who had opened up their hearts in letters, meeting now as strangers, but not really strangers at all. I was so worried, Victoria finally said. When the train got stuck and the storm was howling, I thought maybe you wouldn't wait, that you would think I had changed my mind or that I wasn't coming at all. I thought I had lost my chance before I even had one. No, Yates said with firmness in his voice. I promised to be here, and I was here. I will always be here for you, Victoria. That is a promise I can make and keep. Her eyes started to fill with tears then, but she blinked them back real fast. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what that means to me. The moment was broken up by the conductor yelling for passengers to come get their luggage. Yates helped Victoria point out her trunk, which was a big, beat-up thing that she said held everything she owned in the entire world. He lifted it up onto his shoulder without any trouble and carried it over to the wagon, then made 2 more trips for her other bags. He was pleased to see that she had brought books and sensible clothes that would be good for life on a ranch, and a small wooden box that she handled with extra care. My mother's dishes, she explained when she saw him looking. They're the only thing I have left of hers. She passed away when I was 12. We'll take real good care of them, Yates promised her. He helped her up onto the wagon seat and tucked the heavy blankets around her legs. It's an 8-mile ride out to the ranch. The road's going to be rough with all this snow, but I'll go as slow and easy as I can. Are you warm enough? I'm fine, Victoria said, but her teeth were chattering just a little. Without a second thought, Yates shrugged out of his heavy coat and laid it across her shoulders. Yates, you'll freeze to death, she protested. I've got another coat in the back, he lied. Please, you've been cold for long enough. She didn't argue anymore, just pulled the coat around herself, thankfully. It smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something that was just him, a smell she found surprisingly comforting. They started off with the horse named Dancer pulling the wagon steadily through the street, which was packed down with snow. Folks from the town waved and called out hellos, and Yates saw how Victoria's face turned red with embarrassment at all the attention. I'm sorry about the welcome party, he said. It's a small town and there's not much excitement. The folks are just curious and friendly. It's all right, Victoria said. I guess I'll have to get used to being known. Back in Philadelphia, you could walk down a street and not see a single soul you recognized. Here, it seems like everybody knows everybody. That's the truth of it. It can be a good thing and a bad thing. It's good when you're in a tight spot and need help, but it's bad when you're wanting some privacy. They rode on without talking for a little while, with the wagon creaking in the snow and their breath making little clouds in the cold air. The wide open land stretched out all around them. The snow was so white and pure it seemed to stretch on forever. Victoria just stared, her eyes wide with wonder. It is just so big, she whispered. I knew it would be, but seeing it for yourself is a whole different story. A person can see for miles and miles out here. Back in Philadelphia, all you ever see are the buildings blocking out the sky. Does it scare you any? Yates asked, watching her face for any sign of doubt. She thought about his question for a real moment. A little bit, she finally admitted, but it also makes me feel brand new. Like I could be anybody I wanted out here, do anything I set my mind to. Back east, everybody knew my father and my situation. I was just poor Vicky Morrison, the girl whose dad drank his life away and left her with nothing. Out here, I can be Victoria Jane, and nobody knows a thing about me except what I choose to share. Victoria Jane Franklin, Yates said softly, if that is still what you want. I know we agreed on it in our letters, but now that you are here and seeing how things really are, I would surely understand if you wanted to take some more time. Get to know me a little better before we make it official." Victoria turned and really looked at him for the first time. In the bright afternoon light, she saw the worry creasing the corners of his eyes, the good solid strength in his jaw, and the gentle way he held the reins so the ride would be smooth for her. This was a good man, she thought to herself. A true and honest man who waited 3 whole days in a blizzard because he gave his word. "I did nothing but think on that train for 3 days," she said, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life, if I was plumb crazy for traveling clear across the country to marry a man I had never laid eyes on. But then this morning, the conductor told me you had been at that station every single day, right through the worst storm Montana has seen in years. He said you just refused to leave, refused to give up on me. And right then I knew that is the kind of man I want to make a life with. A man who keeps his promises. A man who does not quit when the going gets tough. Yates felt a lump form in his throat. "I am not a wealthy man, Victoria. The ranch pays its way, but there will be hard spells. The winters out here are fierce, and the work is from sunup to sundown. I can promise to be loyal and devoted to you, but I cannot promise you a life of ease. I do not want an easy life," Victoria said with a firm voice. "I want a good life, a life with meaning. I want to build something that matters. In a way, my father's life was easy, all spent in the city with its comforts, and it flat out ruined him. I think maybe a harder life, one with a real purpose, might just be the very thing I need." They arrived at the ranch just as the sun started to dip low, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. The house looked strong and welcoming, with smoke curling up from the chimney where Yates had banked a fire that morning. The barn was solid and looked well cared for, and Victoria could make out a few head of cattle in the distance like dark shadows against all that white. "It is beautiful," she said, and she truly meant every word of it. Yates helped her down from the wagon, his hands feeling strong and steady on her waist. For just a second they stood there close, their faces only inches apart, and Victoria's heart started to pound. Then Yates took a step back, a little color rising in his cheeks. "Let me show you inside," he said. "I have been working to get it ready for you, trying to make it a real home." The house itself was modest, but it was spotless. Downstairs had 2 main rooms, with a loft upstairs for sleeping. In the main room, a stone fireplace stood as its heart, along with a solid wooden table and 4 chairs. Yates pointed out a rocking chair in the corner that had belonged to his mother. The cooking area was simple, yet had everything needed, including a good wood stove and plenty of shelves for food. An open doorway led into the bedroom. It held a big bed with a colorful quilt, a chest of drawers, and a trunk for storage. The window was dressed with the new curtains Yates had bought, a cream color with little blue flowers. "I know it is not much," Yates said, watching her face with a worried look. "But it is built to last. It will keep us warm, and we own it free and clear. I was thinking we could add on as the years pass. Maybe put in a proper sitting room and another bedroom or 2, if we are blessed with children." Victoria turned to him, her eyes shining. "It is wonderful, Yates. Truly, it is more than I ever hoped for." They both stood in the doorway, connecting the 2 rooms, a heavy silence growing between them. After a long moment, Yates finally cleared his throat. "I want you to know something," he began. "I'm not expecting anything from you tonight, or any other night until you are ready. I know we spoke about getting married straight away, but with everything that has happened, all the long delays and hardships, I believe we ought to take our time. Let yourself rest up and get over this long journey. Let us learn about each other as real people, not just words on a page." Victoria felt a huge wave of relief wash over her, mixed with a feeling that was almost like disappointment. "That is mighty decent of you. I must confess I am bone-tired. Being stuck on a train for 3 days is no way to get any rest." "The bedroom is yours," Yates said with firmness in his voice. "I will sleep up in the loft. There is a good mattress up there, and I will be more than comfortable. You take the bed and get some true sleep. In the morning we can talk about all the rest." He then showed her where to find everything she would need. He pointed out the wash basin and the water pitcher, the fresh towels and soap, and the trunk that was now filled with her possessions. He heated some water for her on the stove and brought in a steaming kettle. Then he quietly went outside to give her some privacy. Victoria washed off 3 days of dust and grime from the train, changed into a clean nightgown, and climbed into the bed. The quilts felt soft and heavy, and the pillows smelled like fresh air and sunshine. She was sound asleep in just a few minutes. Up in the loft, Yates lay awake for a long time, just listening to the quiet sound of her breathing from down below. She was finally here. She was real. After all the months of letters and all the weeks of waiting, Victoria Jane Morrison was sleeping in his house. Tomorrow they would start the journey of figuring out how two strangers could become partners, friends, and maybe with time, something even more. The next morning came up clear and cold. Yates got up early, like he always did, and went out to see to the animals. He fed and watered the horses and the milk cow, gathered eggs from the little chicken coop, and went to check on his cattle. The chores were familiar and calming, and they gave him some time to think about this strange new turn his life had taken. When he got back to the house, he found Victoria was already up and dressed. She was in the kitchen, trying to figure out how to make coffee. She looked a world better than she had the day before, with the tiredness gone from her face and a brightness in her eyes. She had braided her hair and pinned it up neatly, and she was wearing a simple gray dress that looked like it was made for working. "Good morning," she said, a little shy. "I hope you do not mind. I thought I would try my hand at making breakfast, but I have to say, your stove is a bit different from the one I am used to." "Let me give you a hand," Yates said, coming up beside her. He showed her how to work the damper to get the heat just right and where he kept the coffee pot and the skillet. They made breakfast together, moving around each other in the small kitchen with a kind of awkwardness that was actually quite pleasant. They had eggs and bacon, fresh bread from Mrs. Patterson's store, and strong hot coffee. They sat together at the table, eating in a comfortable sort of silence. At last, Victoria was the first to speak. "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday about waiting to get hitched. I surely do appreciate you being so thoughtful, but I reckon we might be making this harder than it needs to be. We have been writing letters for 3 whole months. We have shared our hopes, our worries, and our biggest dreams. We are both grown folks who walked into this with our eyes wide open. Maybe we ought to just go on with the plan and have faith it will all work out." Yates set his coffee mug down real gentle-like. "Are you sure about that? I do not want you feeling pushed into anything." "I am sure," Victoria answered, looking him straight in the eye. "You stood out in a blizzard for 3 days just for me. That speaks volumes about the kind of man you are." "I want to be your wife, Yates Franklin. That is, if you will still have me." "I do," he managed to say, his voice thick with feeling. "More than anything." "Well then, let us ride into town today and have a word with the preacher, long as you think the roads are not too treacherous." "The roads are clear enough," Yates said, "and it would make me proud to take you to town and make you my wife." So they rode back to Marysville that very afternoon, both wearing their Sunday best. The preacher, a reverend named Thomas Carroll, was a good-hearted man in his 50s who had known Yates from the time he was just a kid. He paid close attention to their story and said he would marry them right then and there. "One thing I have learned out here on this land," the reverend said, "is that when the heart knows, there is no sense in putting it off. If you two are sure, I do not see any cause for delay." The wedding was not fancy at all, just held in that little white church on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Frost and Clarence Webb were called over from their businesses to stand as witnesses. Victoria did not have a big white gown, and Yates did not have a gold band. But when they said their words, their voices did not waver one bit. "Do you, Yates Franklin, take Victoria Jane Morrison to be your lawful wife, to have and to hold from this day on through good times and bad, whether you are rich or poor, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Yates said, gazing into Victoria's blue eyes and seeing his entire future right there. "And do you, Victoria Jane Morrison, take Yates Franklin to be your lawful husband, to have and to hold from this day on, through good times and bad, whether you are rich or poor, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Victoria said. and the words felt like they wrapped around her soul, a true blessing. Then, by the authority given to me by the territory of Montana and the good Lord above, I now pronounce you man and wife. Yates, you can go on and kiss your bride." Yates brought his calloused hands up to Victoria's face and kissed her, so soft and respectful, like he was holding something priceless. It was the very first kiss Victoria had ever had, and a pure warmth spread all through her. When they finally separated, they were both grinning from ear to ear. Their witnesses offered their heartfelt congratulations. Mrs. Frost gave Victoria a big hug and whispered, "You got a good one, honey. You treat him right, and he will do even better by you." Clarence gave Yates's hand a firm shake and said he would treat them to supper at the hotel to celebrate. They were grateful for the offer and accepted. The little group sat down together for a meal of roast chicken with potatoes and apple pie to finish it off. With the sun dipping low in the sky, Yates and Victoria headed back to the ranch, no longer two separate people but husband and wife. The truth of it all started to sink in slow and steady on that ride home. They were married. They were a team now, their lives tied together for good. Back at the house, Yates got the fire going good and strong, while Victoria slipped into a dress that was easier to move in. When she came out of the bedroom, he was just standing by the window looking out as the day faded to night. He turned around when he heard her, and for a long moment, they just stood there looking at each other. "Are you happy?" Victoria asked in a soft voice. "I am happier than I have been in a long, long time," Yates answered. And he meant it. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Not a one," she said, with no hesitation. "I made this choice, Yates. I chose you, and I am mighty glad I did." He walked over to her then, taking his time, giving her space to back away if she wished. But she did not move an inch. She held her ground, raising her chin to meet his eyes. When his lips met hers this time, the kiss was deeper, full of a passion that the one in the church could not hold a candle to. Victoria just reacted, her arms going around his neck as she leaned into his steady warmth. "I want to be a good wife to you," she whispered right there against his mouth. "I want to make a real go of this." "We will make it work, you and me together," Yates promised. "This is all new to me too, Victoria. We will just learn as we go." That night they truly joined as man and wife. It was a little clumsy at the start, but soon they found a rhythm born of confidence and feeling. There in the peaceful dark of their room, with the fire popping in the other room and the Montana wind howling outside, they started down the road of being real partners. Sure, there was some shyness and fumbling, but underneath it all was a gentleness and a built-in desire. Yates was patient with her, always remembering her inexperience, and Victoria was courageous, meeting him with a trust and a spirit that surprised them both. Afterward, they just laid there, all wrapped up in each other, in the bed. Victoria's head was nestled on Yates's chest, and his arms held her tight. The heavy quilt was tucked up around their shoulders, protecting them from the cold night air. "Thank you for not giving up on me," Victoria said, her voice barely a whisper. "Down at the train station, the conductor, he told me you were there from sunup to sundown every single day. You will never know how much that means to me." "I would have waited a whole lot longer if I had to," Yates said, and he kissed the top of her head. "You were worth every minute of it." "I was so scared on that train," she confessed. "When we got snowed in and the time just dragged on, I started thinking it was some kind of punishment for being so bold. Like I had no right to try and find a new life, to look for a little happiness. My daddy always said folks like us were born to have it rough, and we should just learn to live with it." "Well, your father was wrong," Yates said, his voice firm. "Every single person deserves a shot at being happy. It took a lot of grit to come all the way out here, Victoria. Not many people have that in them. Kind of courage." "I reckon it was more desperation than anything," she said with a little chuckle. "I did not have a thing left for me in Philadelphia. No kin, no chances, no future at all. When I spotted your notice in the newspaper, it was like someone threw me a rope. It was a chance to be a different person in a different place. You can be anybody you want to be out here, Yates told her. What is in the past is done. All that matters is what is ahead of us. They drifted off to sleep just like that, holding on to each other. And when the sun came up, Yates opened his eyes to find Victoria was already dressed and trying her hand at breakfast again. She had better luck with that old stove this time, and they shared a meal in the pale morning light, talking about their plans. The winter that came after was a season of learning and finding their way. Victoria got used to the pace of the ranch, the constant chores of looking after the livestock, and how you had to think ahead for what the day might bring. She figured out how to milk their cow, even though the old girl was wary of her to begin with, and took some gentle convincing. She learned the trick to collect an eggs without sending the hens into a fuss, how to churn her own butter, and how to bake a loaf of bread that would rise just right in that dry Montana air. Yates taught her how to handle a horse, starting her on his calmest mare, a gentle old thing named Willow. It turned out Victoria was born for the saddle, not a bit scared and a real quick study. Before long, she was riding out with Yates on his daily rounds, helping him check the herd and fix up fences. The work was tough, no doubt about it, and the weather could be downright cruel. But Victoria found a deep satisfaction in working with her hands and seeing what she had accomplished when the day was done. They got to know each other inside and out during those long, cold months. Yates found out that Victoria had a love for books and had packed a whole mess of them for her journey. In the evenings, she would read to him while he fixed his gear or carved a piece of wood, her clear voice filling their little house with tales from faraway lands. Victoria soon discovered that Yates had a bone-dry sense of humor that only came out when he was relaxed. She also learned he sang while he worked, humming the old tunes his mother had taught him. They began to figure out the physical part of their marriage, too, growing more and more comfortable in each other's arms. What felt clumsy at the start soon became natural. And then it turned into real passion. They learned what pleased the other, how to speak without a single word, and how to find pure joy in being together. Come January, a warm spell came through and melted most of the snow. So Yates took Victoria into town for supplies and a little socializing. She met more of the townsfolk and was surprised by how warmly they welcomed her. Ms. Patterson took her under her wing right away, introducing her to the other ranchers' wives and inviting her to the weekly ladies' sewing circle. Victoria was a bit shy at first, worrying that her fancy Eastern ways and schooling might set her apart. But the women of Marysville were as warm and accepting as could be. There was Sarah Mitchell, whose husband was the one who ran the livery stable. She was a down-to-earth woman in her 40s with 4 grown children, and more knowledge about surviving frontier winters than any book could teach you. There was also young Emma Thompson, a newlywed just like Victoria, and just as eager to find a friend her own age. And then there was Martha Green, the saloon keeper's wife, who surprised Victoria with her sharp mind and keen sense for business. Altogether, these women became a circle of support that Victoria never even knew she was missing. February brought a blue norther that tested every last bit of their grit. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in a heartbeat, and stepping outside without being bundled up meant frostbite in just a few minutes. Yates and Victoria hunkered down close to the fire, only going out when they absolutely had to for the animals. They lost 2 head of cattle to the cold, which pained Yates deeply, but they saved the rest by moving them closer to the barn and giving them extra feed. During those long frozen days, they talked about all their dreams for the future. Yates wanted to grow the herd and maybe even add some horses for breeding. Victoria talked about her wish to plant a vegetable garden come spring so they could have fresh food to eat and put up for the winter. They both hoped for children, though Victoria confessed she was nervous about giving birth, especially being so far from any real doctor. "We will face it together," Yates promised her, "and you will have the women from town to help you. Ms. Patterson has delivered half the babies in this whole county. You will be in good hands." March finally rolled in with the first hints of spring. The days got a little bit longer each time, and the snow began to melt for good, turning the roads into rivers of mud. Victoria was shocked by just how much mud there was, by the way it sucked at her boots and splattered clear up to her knees. But underneath all that muck, she could see the first green shoots of grass pushing through, and that sight filled her clean up with hope. She found out she was pregnant in early April. She had suspected it for a few weeks, having missed her monthly visitor and feeling a bit queasy in the mornings, but she waited until she was absolutely sure before telling Yates. She picked a quiet evening after supper when they were sitting by the fire, with her head resting on his shoulder. "I have something to tell you," she said in a soft voice. Yates looked over at her, a little worried by how serious she sounded. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong. In fact, everything is just right." She took his hand and laid it on her belly, which was still flat. "We are going to have a baby. Sometime in the late autumn, I believe." For a second, Yates just stared at her, letting the words sink in. Then his face broke into the biggest smile Victoria had ever seen. He let out a happy whoop and swept her right up into his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing and begging him to set her back down. "A baby," he kept on saying. "We are going to have a baby, Victoria. That is the best news I have ever heard. You are not worried?" she asked. "About the responsibility, about how we will manage?" "Of course I am a little worried," he admitted, "but mostly I am just thrilled to pieces. We are going to be a family, Victoria. A real family." They held each other tight, both of them filled with a mix of excitement and nerves about what was coming. A baby would change everything they knew, but it felt like the most natural step in their life together, the very next chapter in their story. Spring burst open for real after that, turning the brown land into a green carpet sprinkled with wildflowers. Victoria planted her garden with seeds she had ordered from a catalog, carefully watching over the little shoots that poked up from the dirt. She planted potatoes and carrots, beans and squash, tomatoes and all sorts of herbs. Yates built her a fence to keep the rabbits out and gently teased her about how determined she was to make every single thing grow. As her pregnancy moved along, Victoria truly bloomed. The morning sickness went away after the first couple of months, and she felt stronger and more full of energy than ever before. She kept on helping with the ranch work, even though Yates was always worrying about her overdoing it. She just laughed off his fussing with a good-natured stubbornness and kept right on working until her growing belly made some chores impossible. The summer was just glorious. The days were long and warm, and Victoria spent hours in her garden, pulling weeds and watering and watching her plants get bigger. The harvest started in late July, and she was so excited to pick that first ripe tomato, still warm from the sun and tasting like pure summer. She canned and preserved everything she could, following the directions from a well-loved cookbook and the advice she got from the women in town. By September, her shelves were all lined with jars of pickles and tomatoes, applesauce and sweet preserves. The cattle were doing great, and Yates was able to sell several head for a good price, giving them a bit of a financial cushion that eased his constant worry about providing for his growing family. He used some of that money to buy lumber and started building an addition onto the house, a real nursery for the baby. He worked on it every spare minute he had, determined to get it finished before Victoria's time came. In October, just as the leaves were turning gold and the first frost kissed the ground, Victoria started to feel the first little signs that the baby would be coming soon. She sent word into town, and Ms. Patterson arrived with Emma Thompson and Sarah Mitchell right behind her. They took over the house with a calm that knew exactly what to do, boiling water and getting clean linens ready, while Yates paced back and forth outside, too nervous to be any help at all. The labor was a long and hard road. Victoria was strong, but it was her first child, and the whole process seemed to stretch on forever. Yates could hear her cries of pain through the bedroom door, and every single one felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He wanted to go to her, to hold her hand and tell her everything would be all right, but the women told him he would only be in the way. Finally, as the sun was starting to break on the second day, a brand new sound cut through the air, the thin, angry cry of a newborn baby. Yates froze right where he stood, his heart pounding in his chest. A moment later, Ms. Patterson came out of the bedroom, her face looking tired but smiling. "You have a son," she told him. "A big, healthy boy. And your wife is doing just fine. Plumb tuckered out, but fine." Yates rushed right past her and into the bedroom. Victoria was propped up on some pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale, but her eyes were shining with pure joy. In her arms was a tiny little bundle wrapped in a clean blanket. Yates walked over slowly, almost scared to breathe. "Come meet your son," Victoria said softly. Yates sat down carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny red face peeking out of the blanket. The baby had stopped crying and was now looking around with eyes that had not quite figured out how to focus. He had a full head of dark hair and perfect little fingers that opened and closed in the air. "He is beautiful," Yates whispered. "You are just amazing, Victoria. I am in awe of you." "We made him together," Victoria said, her voice full of wonder. "He is ours, Yates, our son." They named him Thomas, after Yates's father, who had passed away when Yates was just a boy. Thomas Franklin arrived with the autumn, and his presence changed absolutely everything. The house, which had been so quiet before, was now filled with all the sounds of a baby, from crying to cooing, the soft sound of Victoria singing lullabies, and the creak of the new rocking chair that Yates had built. Those first months were exhausting. Victoria was up at all hours of the night feeding Thomas, and Yates tried to help wherever he could, changing diapers and walking the floor with his son whenever he got fussy. They were both running on empty and a bit overwhelmed, but they were also happy as could be. For the most part, Thomas was a good baby, healthy and growing bigger every day. Winter came around again, their second one in Montana, but this time Victoria was ready. She knew what to expect. She knew how to handle the cold and the feeling of being cut off, and she was not really cut off anymore, not at all. She had friends who came to visit when the weather was clear, bringing little gifts for the baby and good advice for the new mother. She had a husband who absolutely adored her and a son who needed her for everything. She had purpose and she had meaning and she had love. A full year to the day after Victoria's train got stuck in that snowstorm, she and Yates were sitting together by the fire. Their boy, Thomas, was fast asleep in his cradle, his little chest moving up and down nice and steady. Victoria was sewing up a tear in one of Yates's shirts, and Yates was the one reading a story out loud from one of her books. Snow was coming down again outside, but in that little house, they were warm and safe and perfectly content. "Do you ever have regrets?" Yates asked out of the blue, putting the book down. "About coming out here? About marrying me? Any of it?" Victoria raised her head from her sewing, a little taken aback. "Not for 1 second. Why on earth would you ask a thing like that?" "Well, I know it has been a hard life. Being so far from everything, the endless work, these tough winters. It is not what you could have had back east." "The life I could have had back east was not a life at all," Victoria said, her voice strong. "If I was fortunate, I would have been working in some factory or cleaning another person's house. I would have been broke, lonely, and no one would have even known I existed. Out here, I mean something. I have a home, a family, and a real future. How in the world could I ever regret that? I just want you to be happy, Yates." "I am happy," Victoria promised him. "I am happier than I ever thought I could be." "Are you happy?" "More than words can say," Yates answered. "When I put that notice in the matrimonial news, I was just hoping for a partner, somebody to share the work and ease the loneliness. But you have given me so much more than that. You gave me love and a family, and a real reason to build something that will last." They put their chores aside and moved closer together on the couch. Victoria leaned up against Yates's side, and he put his arm around her shoulders. They sat there in a peaceful quiet, watching the flames flicker and listening to the soft breathing of their son. "Tell me the story again, about you waiting at the station," Victoria said in a soft voice. "I just love that story." Yates smiled down at her. "You already know it by heart." "I know, but I like hearing you tell it." "All right then," Yates said, and he leaned down to kiss the top of her head. I was supposed to meet your train on December 20th. I got to the station way too early. I was too nervous to stay put at home. But the train was late, and then that blizzard rolled in. Clarence, the station master, he told me to go home because folks were saying the train might be stuck for days, but I just could not bring myself to leave. I pictured you out there somewhere, cold and likely worried, wondering if anyone was even waiting for you. So I stayed put. I waited that whole first day, and when the train never showed, I came right back the second day, and then the third. I did it because I gave you my word, and I aimed to keep it. And when I finally got off that train, you were standing right there, Victoria said, finishing his thought. Just like you promised, and just like I promised, Yates agreed. And I will always be there for you, Victoria. No matter what comes our way, no matter how tough things get, I will be there. That was a promise I made to myself during those 3 days in the snow, and it is a promise I will keep for the rest of my days. Victoria lifted her face to his and kissed him, slow and sweet. I love you, Yates Franklin. I do not reckon I knew what love truly was until I met you, but I sure know now. You showed me. I love you too, Yates whispered against her lips. More than any words could ever say, the years that came after were full and rich. Thomas went from a baby to a little fella full of curiosity and energy, always keeping his parents on their toes. When he turned 2, Victoria found out she was expecting again. And in the spring of 1885, they welcomed a daughter they named Margaret Rose. Everyone started calling her Maggie, and she had her mama's blue eyes and her daddy's dark hair. Her older brother just adored her. The ranch kept on thriving. Yates grew the herd and started raising horses just like he had always dreamed of. Victoria's garden got bigger every single year, and she got a reputation around the area for her canned preserves and pickles, which she sold in town for a little extra money. They built more rooms onto the house, making it bigger to fit their growing family and the life they were making together. In 1887, Victoria was pregnant for a third time. This one was harder than the others, and Victoria was often sick and worn out. Yates worried about her constantly, but she just insisted she was fine, only tired. In the late fall, she gave birth to twin boys, James and John, who entered the world a bit small but perfectly healthy. All of a sudden, the house was mighty crowded and loud, but Yates and Victoria would not have wanted it any other way. Thomas proved he was born to be a rancher, trailing his father everywhere and soaking up everything he could about cattle and horses. Maggie was a quieter soul, more the studious type, who preferred helping her mother around the house and in the garden or just curling up with a good book. The twins were a mischievous pair and thick as thieves, always finding new ways to get into trouble and make the whole family laugh. As their children grew, the love between Yates and Victoria deepened and matured. They had started out as strangers writing letters and had become true partners, facing down every challenge side by side and celebrating every victory together. They had made it through brutal winters and scorching summers, lean times and personal heartaches. And through every bit of it, they had each other. One December evening in 1890, 8 years after Victoria first came to Montana, they found themselves alone for a rare, quiet moment. All the children were sound asleep. The house was peaceful, and they sat together by the fireplace like they had countless times before. 8 years, Victoria said with a little laugh. Can you believe it has been 8 years since my train got held up? Best 3 days I ever spent waiting, Yates said, a smile spreading across his face. It changed my whole life. Mine too, Victoria agreed. She was 31 now and still a beautiful woman, but with fine lines around her eyes from smiling and a few strands of silver she had recently discovered. Yates was 34, his face more weathered by the sun and wind, his hands rougher from years of hard work. But when they looked at one another, they could still see the young man and woman who had met on that train platform 8 years ago, full of nothing but hope and grit. Do you remember how nervous we both were? Victoria asked. How clumsy those first few days felt. I remember thinking you were the prettiest woman I had ever laid eyes on, Yates said. And I was scared to death that you would take one look at this ranch and head straight back to Pennsylvania. I remember thinking you were so kind, Victoria said. The way you tucked those blankets all around me in the wagon. The way you insisted I take your coat even though you were shivering too. That is the moment I knew I had made the right decision. We have had a good life together, have not we? Yates asked. The best life, Victoria confirmed. Better than anything I could have ever dreamed up back when I answered your advertisement. They sat there in a comfortable silence, holding hands, and watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Outside, a gentle snow had started to fall again, just like it had 8 years ago when Victoria's train was delayed. But this time, they were together, warm and safe inside the home they had built, surrounded by the family they had made. The years kept rolling by, marked by the turning of the seasons and the steady growth of their children. Thomas grew up tall and strong, taking on more and more responsibility at the ranch as he got older. At 19, he married Emma Thompson's daughter, Sarah, a sweet girl who loved him with all her heart. They built a small house for themselves on the edge of the ranch and started their own family, making Yates and Victoria grandparents for the very first time when little Victoria Jane Franklin was born in the spring of 1895. Maggie, it turned out, had a gift for teaching and started working at the little schoolhouse in Marysville when she was 18. She had a patience and kindness with the children that made her a favorite among her students and their parents. She married a banker named Robert Hayes when she was 22, a good, steady man who cherished her quiet strength. They made their home in town, but came out to the ranch often. The twins, James and John, stayed inseparable right on into adulthood. They worked the ranch side by side, each man's strengths making up for the other's weaknesses. When they were 20, they both fell head over heels for a pair of sisters from a neighboring ranch, and they had a double wedding that was the biggest social event Marysville had seen in years. As Yates and Victoria got older, they started to step back from the hard day-to-day work of running the ranch, letting their sons take the reins while they enjoyed the rewards of all their years of labor. They spent their days tending the garden, reading, visiting with their ever-growing flock of grandchildren, and just plain enjoying being with each other. One especially cold December day in 1905, Yates and Victoria took a trip into Marysville for supplies. As they guided the wagon into town, Yates slowed the horses as they passed by the train depot. It looked mostly the same as it had 23 years before, though it had been added on to and improved over time. The platform where he had waited for 3 long days was still there, though it had been rebuilt and made bigger. "Stop for a minute," Victoria said in a soft voice. Yates pulled the wagon to a halt, and they both just sat there looking at the depot. Victoria was 46 now, her blonde hair more silver than gold, her face etched with the lines of age and experience. Yates was 49. His dark hair was gray at the temples, and his back was not quite as straight as it used to be, but their eyes still held the same deep warmth and love they had shared for more than 2 decades. "It is hard to believe that is where it all began," Victoria said softly. "Where my whole new life started." "Where our life started," Yates corrected her gently. They sat there for a good long while, just remembering the mix of fear and excitement of that first meeting, remembering the awkwardness of the first days of their marriage, remembering all the struggles and triumphs, the sorrows and the joys that had filled all the years since. "I have never asked you," Victoria said, her voice catching him by surprise. "In all this time, I have never once asked. When that blizzard hit and the train was stuck, when one day turned into 2 and then 3, did you ever think about leaving? About just giving up and going on home?" Yates turned to look right at her, his weathered face completely serious. "Never," he said, his voice firm. "Not for a single second. I had made you a promise, Victoria. I told you I would be waiting here when you got here, and I meant every word of it. I would have waited a week or a month, however long it took, because even though I had never laid eyes on you, I knew from your letters that you were a woman worth waiting for." And I was right. Victoria could feel tears welling up in her eyes, even after all this time. "You are still the most dependable man I have ever known, the most loyal, the most true. That part of you has never changed." "Real love does not change," Yates said simply. "It might grow and get deeper, but the heart of it stays the same. I loved you the moment you stepped off that train 23 years ago, and I love you now, And I will love you until my last day on this earth. And I love you, Victoria said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Thank you for waiting for me, Yates. For those 3 days in the snow, and for every single day since. They carried on into town, got their errands done, and headed for home as the short winter day began to fade. Their house was aglow with light and filled with warmth and noise as several of their children and grandchildren had come over for supper. The dinner table was crowded and chaotic, with a dozen conversations happening at once and little ones squirming in their chairs. After the meal, as the family gathered, in the main room, young Thomas asked his grandfather a question he had asked 100 times before, but one he never got tired of hearing the answer to. Grandpa, tell us the story again about how you met Grandma, about the train and all that snow. Yates looked over at Victoria, and she gave him a warm nod and a smile. The story had become a family legend, told and retold at every gathering, a story about patience and keeping your word, and how a great love began. Well, Yates started, and the whole room went quiet as everyone turned to listen. It was back in December of 1882, and I was waiting at the train depot in Marysville for a woman I had never even met. Her name was Victoria Jane Morrison, and she was coming all the way from Pennsylvania to be my wife. As Yates told the story, Victoria looked around at the family they had built. Her children, all grown up now with families of their own. Her grandchildren, their eyes wide and listening closely. And her husband still as handsome as ever to her after all these years, his voice full of warmth as he told the story of their beginning. Yates carried on with his story, saying, that train was scheduled to pull in on December the 20th. But a storm hit, the nastiest blizzard Montana had seen in a good long while. The train got hung up 40 miles to the west, unable to push through all that snow. I waited at that depot for the entire day, but the train just never came. I headed back the next day and then the day after that one. For 3 whole days I waited there in the biting cold and blowing snow because I had made a promise. And that's when Grandma finally showed up. One of the grandkids couldn't hold it in any longer and blurted out, and then your grandma finally showed up. Yates nodded, his gaze finding Victoria's from across the room. She stepped down from that train looking tired and chilled, but absolutely beautiful. And my real life started right then and there. Maggie's daughter let out a sigh. That is just the most romantic story. Victoria spoke up for the first time, her voice clear. It is the truth. Your grandfather waited for me for 3 days in the snow, and he has been waiting for me ever since. Waiting on me to finish my little projects, waiting on me to get ready to go into town, waiting on me to get done talking to Mrs. Patterson. The whole room broke out in laughter. But he has never once complained, she continued, never made me feel like I was a bother, or that he was in a hurry. That is the kind of man your grandfather is, and that is the kind of love we should all hope to find. As the evening drew to a close, and the family eventually headed back to their own houses, Yates and Victoria were finally by themselves again. They got ready for bed, following their old familiar routine, moving around one another with an ease that comes from years of practice. When they at last settled into their bed, the very same one Victoria had slept in on her first night in Montana, they lay there in the quiet darkness, facing each other. I have been doing some thinking, Victoria said softly, about everything we've put together here, this ranch, our family, this whole life, and I came to a realization. What's that? Yates asked, his hand reaching out for hers. I spent the first 23 years of my life feeling like I was just biding my time, waiting for my life to really get started, for something to finally change or happen that would make it all make sense. And then I boarded that train headed for Montana. And it got held up for 3 days in the snow, she went on. I remember thinking that even this one big attempt to start my life over, was just bound to fail. But it wasn't, Yates said in a low voice. No, it surely was not, because you were there waiting for me. And when I finally got there and saw you standing on that platform, I knew I was not waiting anymore. My life had begun. And Lord, what a life it has been, Yates. What a wonderful, full, and blessed life. The very best years of my life have been right here with you, Yates said, his voice thick with feeling. Every last one of them. They fell asleep that night holding hands, just as they had nearly every night for 23 years. Outside, the snow kept coming down, covering the ranch in a blanket of white. But inside their home, they were warm and safe and together. The years kept rolling by, the way years do. Yates and Victoria aged with grace, their love for each other a steady anchor in a world that was always changing. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1907 with a big party that brought family and friends from all over the territory, which was now the state of Montana. They shared a dance that night, a little slower than they used to, but with just as much joy. And they said their vows to each other again under the same stars that had looked down on their very first night together. More grandchildren came along, and after them, great-grandchildren. The ranch kept on doing well under their son's guidance, growing and changing with the times. Thomas had telephone lines put in back in 1910, and Yates spent a solid hour on his first call, just amazed by the new contraption that let him talk to a man miles and miles away. Victoria just laughed at his amazement and reminded him that she had once traveled more than 1,000 miles to meet him, with nothing more to go on than his letters and a whole lot of faith. Then, in 1912, on a warm afternoon in June, Yates had a heart attack while he was working out in the barn. Thomas found him and got him to the house right away, sending for the doctor immediately. Victoria never left his side, just holding his hand and praying harder than she had since her own children were born. The doctor arrived and did all he could, and Yates eventually pulled through, though he never did get all his strength back. "You gave me a terrible fright," Victoria told him once he was strong enough to sit up and have a conversation. "I am not ready to lose you just yet, Yates Franklin. We still have more years left together." "I am not planning on going anywhere," Yates promised her, even though they both understood that wasn't completely up to him. "I have no intention of ever leaving you, Victoria. We made a promise to each other 30 years ago, and I am still aiming to keep it." But that close call was a reminder to them both that they wouldn't be here forever, that the time they had together, no matter how long it had been, had a limit. They started talking more about the important things, making sure their children knew their wishes, and tying up all the loose ends of a life that had been lived so well. On a cold December morning in 1915, precisely 33 years after Victoria's train was delayed by the snow, Yates woke up and saw his wife still asleep next to him. He just laid there quietly, watching her, and felt a wave of wonder at how much he still loved her. Her hair was all white now, and her face was a map of deep lines, but to him, she was just as pretty as the young woman who had stepped down from that train all those years ago. "I can feel you watching me," Victoria mumbled without even opening her eyes. "Just counting my blessings," Yates answered her. Victoria opened her eyes and gave him a smile. 33 years today," she said. "Did you realize that?" "I know," Yates said. 33 years, since I waited for 3 days in the snow for the best thing that ever happened to me." They got up and got dressed, moving a bit slower these days with the stiffness that comes with age. The house was peaceful, as their children and grandkids wouldn't be coming until later for the celebration Victoria had put together. They fixed breakfast with each other, working in that familiar kitchen with all its modern gadgets that still managed to surprise them now and then. "Do you remember that first breakfast?" Victoria asked. "When I tried my hand at making coffee and couldn't make heads or tails of your stove?" "I remember thinking you were the most stubborn woman I had ever laid eyes on," Yates said, "refusing to give up, even when it would have been a whole lot easier to just let me do it." "I wanted to be helpful," Victoria said. "I wanted you to see that I wasn't just some helpless girl from back east who couldn't do anything for herself, could not handle the frontier." "I never for a second thought that," Yates told her, his voice full of certainty. "From the very first moment you stepped down from that train, I saw the steel in you. It was right there in how you carried yourself, in the fire I saw in your eyes. You came halfway across this country to build a new life from scratch. Now that takes real grit. After they finished breakfast, they put on their warm coats to fight off the chill and went for a walk to look over the ranch. The old house had been added on to and fixed up over the years, but the original frame was still there. The barn where Yates had shown Victoria how to milk a cow was still standing, even though a bigger, newer one had been built right next to it. The fences ran out as far as you could see, roping in land they had bought up over time. "We made all this," Victoria said, her voice soft. "Together, from nothing, we made every bit of this." "That we did," Yates said with a nod. "And it'll be here long after we're gone. Our kids and their kids will keep building on what we started." That night, the house was bursting at the seams with family. All 4 of their children showed up with their own families in tow. Grandkids brought their great-grandkids, little babies and toddlers who had only ever known their great-grandparents as old folks. The dinner table looked like it might collapse from all the food, and the whole house echoed with laughter and talk. After the meal, Thomas got to his feet and held up his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, and a hush fell over the room. "To my mom and dad, Yates and Victoria Franklin, on the 33rd anniversary of the day they first met." He continued, "Y'all have shown every one of us what real love is, what it means to stick together, and what it takes to build a life and a family. You gave us a place to come home to and the courage to go out and make our own way. We love you both, and we're thankful every single day for the example you've set." "Hear, hear," the family called out as their glasses chimed together. Yates then stood up, a little shaky on his feet, and Victoria stood right beside him. He scanned the room, looking at the faces of his family, the living proof of his and Victoria's love. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said. "Your grandmother and I are blessed, more than we could ever say by this family, but I need to tell you all something important. The life we built, well, it wasn't always a smooth ride. We had some tough times, some lean years, and moments where we didn't know if we'd pull through, but we always had each other, and that was the one thing that made all the difference." He turned to Victoria and took both of her hands in his. 33 years ago, I waited 3 whole days in the snow for you, and I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. I'd wait a lifetime if that's what it took, because you, Victoria Jane Franklin, were worth every single second of that wait. You've been the very best part of my life, the answer to prayers I didn't even have the sense to pray. I love you just as much today as I did the day you got off that train, maybe even more, because now I know for sure what a treasure I was waiting for." Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes. "And I love you, Yates Franklin. You gave me everything I ever dreamed of and so much more I never even knew I wanted. You gave me a home, a family, a reason for being, and a love that has carried me through every hard patch. You kept your promise. You were right there waiting for me back then, and you've been waiting for me ever since, always patient and steady and true." They shared a kiss then, with their whole family clapping and cheering them on. It was a kiss that held 33 years of love and partnership, of happy times shared and sorrows faced, of a good life lived side by side. The years that came after were softer and more peaceful. Yates's heart started to give him more trouble, and he spent more of his days resting than working. Victoria's own health began to decline. Her joints ached with arthritis, and sometimes she found it hard to catch her breath. But they took on these new problems just like they had all the others in their marriage, together. They would pass long hours just sitting on the porch Yates had built 40 years before, watching the sun dip below the horizon of their ranch, and talking about old times. They talked about how proud they were of their children and what the future held for their grandchildren. They remembered their first years together, the struggles and the victories that had made them who they were. And sometimes they would just sit there in a comfortable quiet, holding hands and just being near each other. One evening in the summer of 1917, as they sat on that porch watching the daylight fade away, Yates turned to Victoria. "I want you to know something," he said. "If I had the chance to do it all again, I wouldn't change a single thing. Not one day, not one choice." He continued, "This life I've had with you has been everything I ever could have wanted. Not even the tough parts? Victoria asked him softly. The years when money was scarce, the winter we lost so many cattle, the times we were just barely scraping by? Not even those, Yates said, his voice firm. Because those hard times showed us what we were really made of. They proved to us that we could count on each other, that our love was strong enough to get through any dry spell. Without those tough times, we might not have cherished the good times quite as much. You are a wise man, Yates Franklin, Victoria said with a small smile. I am a lucky man, Yates corrected her. Smart enough to know a good thing when I saw it, and stubborn enough to wait for 3 days in a snowstorm to get it. Victoria let out a laugh, a sound that was still like music to him after all those years. You are never going to let me live down those 3 days, are you? Never, Yates agreed. Those 3 days changed my whole world. They brought me you, and you brought me a life I couldn't have even dreamed up. Why on earth would I ever want to forget that? They sat there as the sky turned dark, wrapped up in blankets against the night's chill, and watched the stars pop out one after another in the big Montana sky. They were the same stars that had shone down on their very first night together all those years ago, always there and unchanging, watching over a love that had lasted and grown and become richer with time. Yates Franklin passed on in his sleep one cold January morning in 1918, just 2 weeks after his 62nd birthday. He was lying right beside Victoria, just as he had for 35 years, and she woke up to find that he was gone. She stayed there for a long while, holding his hand that was still warm, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting for me, my love. Thank you for every single day, every year, every moment we had. I will love you until we're together again." The funeral was so packed it seemed like half the county had turned out. Yates had been a man people looked up to and liked in the community, known for being fair, a good neighbor, and a man who adored his wife and children. But to Victoria, he was simply the man who had waited 3 days in the snow for her, and then spent the rest of his life showing her that she had been worth the wait. Victoria lived on for 5 more years after Yates passed away, and those years were both lonely and full. She was always surrounded by her children and grandchildren, who made sure she never felt completely on her own. She stayed in the house that she and Yates had built with their own hands, tending to her garden in the warm months, and sitting by the fireplace in the cold ones, reading the books they had once shared. She talked about Yates all the time, keeping his memory bright for the younger ones who had never known him in his best years. She would tell stories about their early days on the ranch, about his patience and his kindness, of the life he had carved out of the wilderness through sheer grit and hard work. She never tired of telling the story of those 3 long days back in December of 1882. Her train was stuck dead in the snow, and the cowboy who would become her husband stood his ground, waiting faithfully right there at the station. That, she would tell her great-grandchildren, was the measure of your grandfather. He was a man who kept his promises, a man who knew when to wait and knew when to work. He was a man who loved with every fiber of his being and never once backed down from that love. That is the kind of person y'all ought to strive to be. Victoria passed on peacefully in her sleep one spring morning in 1923, surrounded by pictures of her family and the world she and Yates had made together. She was 64 years old and had lived a life fuller than she ever could have dreamed of as a scared young woman getting on a train in Pennsylvania 41 years before. At her funeral, Thomas spoke of his parents' love and the powerful example they set for everyone they knew. "My father waited 3 days in the snow for my mother," he told the crowd. "And after that, he kept on waiting every single day. He waited for her to finish her projects, waited for her to make up her mind, waited with a patience and love that was solid as a rock. And my mother, she loved him with a loyalty that never wavered, not through the hard times or the good, not in sickness or in health, just like they promised each other all those years ago. They showed us all what love really is about. It is about patience, about sticking it out, about commitment, and about having a deep-down faith in each other." They laid Victoria to rest next to Yates in the little cemetery just outside Marysville. They shared a single headstone that simply said, Yates Franklin, 1856 to 1918, Victoria Jane Franklin, 1859 to 1923. He waited, she came. Together they built a legacy of love. And Lord, they surely did. The ranch kept on growing, run by their children and their children's children, changing and getting better with the times. The story of how they met became a treasured family tale, handed down from one generation to the next. The house they had built and added on to over all those years was still standing strong, lived in by their kin who kept on farming the land and raising cattle on the Montana plains. Over in the town of Marysville, the old train depot where Yates had stood watch for those 3 days was eventually torn down for a newer building. But someone put up a plaque to tell the story of the cowboy who waited through a blizzard for the woman he was going to marry. It came to stand for the kind of love and grit that built the West. Patient, tough, and true. The years turned into decades, and the decades rolled into a century. The whole world changed in ways no one could have pictured, with cars taking the place of horses and wagons and telephones and later on, computers, connecting folks across the country in an instant. But the story of Yates and Victoria Franklin stayed the same, a solid reminder of the power of love and the importance of keeping your word. Their great-great-grandchildren would, from time to time, go out to that old cemetery. They would stand there before that shared headstone, reading the words and thinking about the two people who started it all. They would try to picture a young cowboy standing on a platform covered in snow, just refusing to let his hope die out, even as the hours stretched into days. They would imagine a young woman stepping down from a train, worn out and worried, only to find the man who had kept his promise to be there. And right there, they would understand that sometimes the most important things in this life are worth the wait. They would see that love is not just a feeling, but a choice and a promise you have to renew every single day. Yates Franklin had shown them that by waiting 3 days in the snow, and then spending a lifetime waiting for and waiting with Victoria. And Victoria had shown them that taking a big chance on love, even if it meant leaving everything you knew behind, could lead to a life richer than anything they could have ever dreamed up. The legacy of those 3 days in December of 1882. It just lived on, generation after generation. It was a story of a love that had made it through tough times and the passing of years. It was a reminder that the best things in life often ask for a little patience, a little faith, and the courage to step out into a future you cannot see. It was a legacy built on a bedrock of trust and kept alive through years of pure devotion. And it would keep on going long after the last person who ever knew Yates and Victoria personally was gone. Because some stories are just too powerful to ever be forgotten. Some kinds of love are too true to fade away with time. And some promises, once they are made and faithfully kept, echo on down through the generations, inspiring other folks to love as deep, wait as patiently, and commit as completely as the cowboy who waited 3 days in the snow and the brave young woman who crossed a whole continent to find him. Their story was a true happily ever after. Not because their life was easy or without sadness, but because they faced every last thing together, with a love that never quit, and a commitment to each other, and the promises they had made. They built a family, a home, and a legacy that would surely stand long after they were gone. And that whole beautiful story began with just 3 days of waiting in the snow. 3 days that changed 2 lives forever, and created a love story that would be told for ages. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.